In the quiet hills of Antioquia, amidst Colombia's rugged terrain and lush green valleys, there existed a man whose very name was enough to send shivers down the spines of anyone who had heard of him. Fernando, the fused Cifuentes, was a figure surrounded by a haze of mystery, his rise to power marked by an explosive combination of ingenuity and ruthlessness. His name, whispered in fear and awe, became synonymous with terror, and the devastation he unleashed upon Colombia in the late 1980s was as much a product of his mind as it was of the deadly tools he used. His legacy, one of destruction, violence, and precision, still lingers in the shadows of the country's criminal history. The streets of Medellin, with their chaotic energy and constant movement, held many secrets, none more dangerous than the one that was about to unfold. Colombia in the 1980s was a place where corruption ran deep, where drug cartels ruled with an iron fist, and where power was often seized through the most brutal of means. In this environment, a young man like Cifuentes could disappear into the darkness, drawn to the world of crime as easily as others might have been drawn to the promise of a peaceful life. But Cifuentes was not like most young men, he was drawn to a far more dangerous world, the world of explosives and chaos. What made Cifuentes particularly terrifying was not just his ability to cause destruction, but his methodical approach to it. Where other criminals used brute force, Cifuentes used his mind. He was the master of the bomb, a calculated architect of terror whose expertise turned the simple act of violence into an art form. His bombs didn't just kill, they sent a message. The fuse, as he would come to be known, had the power to turn an ordinary day into one of unthinkable horror. His name, when spoken aloud, conjured images of ticking clocks and the eerie silence of a device waiting to explode. At the time, Medellin was one of the most dangerous cities in the world, controlled by the fearsome Medellin cartel, led by the infamous Pablo Escobar. The cartel dominated the international drug trade, particularly cocaine, and ruled with brutality. It was a city where violence was a currency, and loyalty was bought with blood. In this dark underworld, Fernando Cifuentes quickly became a figure of importance. But it wasn't his ability to kill that set him apart, it was his expertise in creating terror that made him invaluable. His bombs became the signature of a new era of crime, one where violence was not only a tool but a spectacle. Cifuentes, known for his cold efficiency, operated in the shadows, creating bombs with a technical precision that earned him the fear and respect of even the most hardened cartel members. He had no interest in the wealth and status that many criminals sought. His obsession was with destruction, the ability to send a message with every explosion, to assert his dominance over a world that was already rife with chaos. Each bomb he made was a step further into the abyss, a move toward becoming something more than just a criminal. He would become a symbol of the terror that gripped his country. His bombs were not just weapons, they were tools of psychological warfare. For Cifuentes, each explosion was a carefully calculated act, a move in a game where the stakes were life and death. He understood that terror wasn't just about inflicting physical harm, it was about controlling the fear of others. The quiet, unassuming nature of his bombs, often hidden in the most innocuous places, made them even more deadly. It was not just the explosion that killed, it was the dread that came before it, the uncertainty of when and where the next one would strike. As Cifuentes honed his craft, the people of Medellin and beyond lived in constant fear of the unknown. Ordinary citizens went about their daily lives, never knowing when or where the next bomb would go off. This created a unique kind of tension, one that made everyday life feel like a precarious balance. It wasn't just the criminal world that felt Cifuentes' wrath, it was everyone. The government, the military, rival cartels, and innocent civilians were all potential targets in the grand game of violence he had chosen to play. The growing fear surrounding Cifuentes' actions wasn't merely about the bodies he left behind. It was about the sheer unpredictability of his strikes. A bomb could explode anywhere, a crowded street, a public building, or even the offices of rival cartels. His ability to operate under the radar, to remain a ghost in the system, made him a haunting figure. Those who came into contact with him knew that they were dealing with someone who was not only dangerous but also deeply intelligent, a man whose methods left no trace, whose actions could not be anticipated. Yet, as with many figures of his time, Cifuentes was a man shaped by his circumstances. His early life in Antioquia, far from the glamour of the criminal world, had exposed him to the poverty and corruption that would shape his future. He wasn't born into a world of violence, he was shaped by it. In a country where the government and society struggled to maintain control, the underworld flourished, offering men like Cifuentes a path to power, albeit one paved with blood and fear. As a young man, he may not have imagined that his future would involve masterminding bombings that would change the course of Colombian history, but the world he was born into had a way of shaping destinies in ways no one could predict. The fuse that would ignite Cifuentes' reign of terror was lit not by a single event, but by a series of choices, each one leading him deeper into the dark heart of Colombia's drug trade. Every step he took further into the world of organized crime brought him closer to the explosive role he would eventually play. The fuse, as he became known, was not just a man who understood explosives, he was a man who understood fear, and how to use it to his advantage. As the story of Fernando, the fuse, Cifuentes unfolds, it is not just one of violence and bombs, it is the story of a man who became both the architect and the weapon of terror. His name would go down in history, not just for the destruction he caused, but for the chilling manner in which he manipulated fear itself. In a world already teetering on the edge of collapse, Cifuentes' bombs became the final push that sent Colombia's criminal landscape into chaos. And for those who lived through it, his name was a constant reminder of the price of power and the dangers of living in the shadows of terror. Fernando Cifuentes was born into a world that seemed far removed from the violence and chaos that would later define his life. Growing up in the lush, rolling hills of Antioquia, a region known for its beauty and its harsh rural realities, he had humble beginnings. The roads were rough, the air thick with the scent of earth, and the rhythm of life was dictated by the demands of the land. Cifuentes' family, like many others, faced the daily struggle of survival. The mountains were not kind to those who did not possess the means to navigate their steep inclines or the wisdom to make the most of the land. It was a world that, in its stillness, echoed with an underlying tension, a tension that would one day pull Fernando into the violent world of Colombia's cartels. In the small towns of Antioquia, life was often defined by work in the fields, community gatherings, and the occasional celebration. But for Cifuentes, the pastoral life was not enough to keep his restless spirit content. The struggles of his family, the poverty that often pressed in from all sides, left a mark on him. His parents, while loving, could not offer him the protection of wealth or status, and the social fabric of his community seemed to fray at the edges. Like many young men, Fernando found himself caught between the simplicity of rural life and the allure of a larger, more dangerous world that was taking root in Colombia. The 1970s and 1980s were times of upheaval in Colombia. The country's political and social systems were crumbling under the weight of corruption, drug trade influence, and the escalating violence between rival factions. The Medellin cartel, under the leadership of Pablo Escobar, was rising in power, and its influence stretched into every corner of Colombia. In Medellin, the beating heart of the cartel, Cifuentes began to notice the pull of this darker world. It was a world of power and violence, a world that seemed to promise more than the humble life in Antioquia could ever provide. Cifuentes was no stranger to the rough edges of life. Even as a young man, he had witnessed the undercurrents of violence in his community, the feuds between rival families, and the quiet rumblings of the emerging drug trade. He knew that to survive in a world where power was seized through force, one had to be both sharp and daring. The young Fernando soon discovered that the cartels weren't the only ones with something to offer, there were many who sought men like him, individuals with grit and ambition who were willing to take risks, even if it meant stepping into a world that could consume them whole. In Medellin, Cifuentes began to immerse himself in the criminal underworld. He was drawn to the individuals who operated from the shadows, the ones whose faces were never seen in public but whose influence stretched far and wide. He saw them as men of action, their power emanating not from titles but from the fear they inspired. This was a world where loyalty was as fragile as glass, and one's survival depended on an ability to navigate the constant treachery that lurked behind every corner. It was here that Cifuentes discovered his true calling, not as a petty thief or street-level thug, but as someone who could rise above the fray and become a key player in the larger game. From a young age, Cifuentes displayed a unique aptitude for mechanics and precision. It wasn't long before his attention turned to something far more sinister than simple street crime: explosives. He saw bombs not just as instruments of destruction, but as tools of power. Where others saw chaos, Cifuentes saw a system. He began to study the intricacies of explosives, how they worked, how they could be constructed, and, more importantly, how they could be used to send a message. In a world where messages were often more powerful than weapons, bombs became his voice, and fear became his language. The decision to enter the realm of explosives was not one Cifuentes took lightly. It was a calculated move, one that placed him at the very center of the Medellin cartel's operations. The cartels, which were rapidly becoming the driving force behind Colombia's drug empire, needed people like him, people who could create terror at will, people who could target their enemies with a precision that left no room for error. As Cifuentes honed his skills, he began to make a name for himself, earning the nickname, the Fuse. His bombs were precise, devastating, and, most importantly, effective. They didn't just destroy property, they created fear, and that fear gave him influence. But the allure of power was not without its dangers. The underworld of Colombia, and particularly Medellin, was a volatile and unpredictable place. The drug trade was constantly shifting, alliances were made and broken in the blink of an eye, and violence was a constant companion. For Cifuentes, survival in this environment required not just skill with explosives but a sharp sense of loyalty and an even sharper sense of paranoia. The cartel was a dangerous machine, but for someone like Cifuentes, it was also an opportunity, a chance to rise, to take control, and to carve out a place in a world ruled by the few who dared to seize it. As Cifuentes rose through the ranks of the Medellin cartel, his expertise in explosives made him invaluable. He was no longer just a small-time criminal, he had become a trusted asset, a man whose bombs struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. His role in the cartel became central, and soon he was given more autonomy, tasked with designing increasingly complex and devastating devices. The bombs he created were not just meant to kill, they were meant to send a message to anyone who dared to challenge the cartel's authority. His bombs became instruments of terror, turning the streets of Medellin into a war zone. Despite his growing power, Cifuentes remained a shadowy figure. He was not interested in the fame or wealth that came with being associated with the cartel's leadership. Instead, he focused solely on his work, on perfecting his craft and expanding his influence. His bombs were more than just weapons, they were a means to control, to dictate the pace of the cartel's battles. With every explosion, Cifuentes became a more feared and respected figure within the criminal underworld. He was a ghost, a man whose name was whispered in terror, and whose presence was felt in the fear that preceded his attacks. As his reputation spread, so did his power. Cifuentes was no longer just a foot soldier in the Medellin cartel's war, he was a key player, an architect of the violence that defined the era. But as with all men who rise to power in such a brutal world, there was no escaping the inevitable. The world that had given him power, that had given him influence, would soon begin to turn against him. And the same tools he used to strike fear into others would eventually become the instruments of his own downfall. Cifuentes' early life in Antioquia, though far from the world of explosives and cartel wars, had shaped him in ways that he could not have foreseen. The struggle of growing up in poverty, the exposure to violence and survival in a country torn apart by war, had prepared him for the harsh reality of the criminal world. But it was his cunning, his ability to think beyond the immediate consequences, that set him apart. Fernando, the Fuse Cifuentes, was not just a product of his environment, he was a man who had learned to master it, using every tool at his disposal to carve his path to power. And in doing so, he left behind a legacy of destruction that would shape Colombia's history for years to come. As Fernando Cifuentes began to immerse himself deeper into the world of Medellin's criminal underworld, he quickly realized that true power in this environment wasn't just about physical strength or the ability to wield violence, it was about control. And control, for Cifuentes, came through a different method, precision. While others focused on the chaos of the street-level drug trade, he saw the potential of becoming a master of an entirely different weapon, the bomb. It was an art form that, when executed correctly, could change the balance of power in an instant, leaving behind nothing but devastation and fear. Cifuentes wasn't just a man who created destruction, he was a strategist who understood how to use fear as a tool. In the volatile world of Colombian cartels, where loyalty was often as fleeting as the next betrayal, creating terror could be just as effective as any assassination. The city of Medellín, under the influence of the Medellín cartel, was in constant turmoil. Drug wars were fought not just in the streets but in boardrooms, in government offices, and in every hidden corner of the city. Those who controlled the flow of cocaine and maintained dominance over rival cartels were often the ones who wielded the most fear, and Cifuentes quickly learned that his expertise in explosives could give him an edge unlike any other. His first encounters with bombs were tentative, a trial-and-error phase where he learned to manipulate explosives with the same care a skilled craftsman would take with delicate tools. The bombs he initially built were simple, but even in their rudimentary form, they were deadly enough to send a message. As he honed his craft, Cifuentes began to realize that his work could be far more than just a tool for immediate destruction, it could be a signature, a calling card that struck terror into the hearts of not only enemies but allies too. His explosives weren't just about killing, they were about sending a warning. In a world where loyalty was bought and sold, Cifuentes found that his work as a bomb maker earned him the respect of those who could help him climb the criminal ladder. Leaders within the Medellín cartel began to notice his skills. To them, he wasn't just a low-level operative or a nameless pawn in a larger game, he was a resource, someone whose talents could shift the tides of power. A bomb could take down a rival leader, destroy a competitor's operations, or destabilize the fragile alliances between the cartels. In a world ruled by violence, this was not only a skill, it was a necessity. As Cifuentes became more deeply entrenched in the Medellín cartel, his role became clearer. He wasn't just an ordinary bomb maker, he was becoming a weapon in the cartel's arsenal. His talents earned him more than just power within the cartel, he gained influence that transcended the mere building of explosives. He began to understand the deeper psychology of his trade. His bombs weren't random acts of terror, they were calculated strikes that sent a message to his enemies: we are watching you. We control this city, and we will do whatever it takes to stay on top. His work also brought him into contact with some of the most powerful and dangerous figures in the cartel. With Pablo Escobar's influence expanding rapidly, the Medellín cartel was beginning to consolidate control over vast swaths of territory and operations. As a result, their internal structure had to adapt, and they sought out specialists like Cifuentes to ensure their power remained unchallenged. In a world where power could be taken at any moment, even the most feared cartel members had to maintain control through intimidation, and this was where Cifuentes' bombs came into play. The first major bombing that would catapult Cifuentes into the upper echelons of the cartel's operations came not as a direct attack on rival cartels, but as a demonstration of power. It was a calculated act of terror aimed at sending a clear message to anyone who dared challenge the Medellín cartel. The target was a strategic government building, an institution meant to represent law and order, an institution that stood as an obstacle to the cartel's unchecked growth. The bomb, carefully placed by Cifuentes himself, was designed to be both deadly and symbolic. It wasn't just about destroying property, it was about breaking the spirit of resistance. The explosion tore through the building with a ferocity that left the city reeling. The force was felt throughout the city, rattling windows in distant neighborhoods, sending tremors through the hearts of anyone who dared to oppose the cartel. For Cifuentes, this first act of terror marked the beginning of his true rise to power. His expertise in explosives quickly became a sought-after asset within the cartel. Leaders like Escobar, whose reputation was built on the violence he orchestrated, saw Cifuentes as more than just a tool of destruction. He was a means to an end. In the ruthless world of the cartel, power was defined by the ability to control and destroy, and Cifuentes had mastered both. His bombs became a weapon of precision, capable of delivering not only physical devastation but a psychological blow to anyone who felt their safety could no longer be guaranteed. As the years went on, Cifuentes' reputation continued to grow. He was no longer just a shadowy figure in the background, someone known only for his ability to craft bombs. He had become an essential part of the cartel's operations, his bombs acting as the cornerstone of their strategy. But with this power came a price. The more successful his attacks became, the more enemies he accumulated. The cartels were not the only ones taking notice of his expertise. Law enforcement, rival gangs, and even the Colombian military were now looking for ways to neutralize him. The very thing that had made him invaluable, his precision and mastery of explosives, was now drawing attention from forces far more dangerous than any cartel member. But Cifuentes was a survivor. The same mind that created bombs capable of wreaking havoc was the one that allowed him to navigate the ever-shifting and treacherous world of Colombian crime. He understood that loyalty in this world was fleeting, and that no one, least of all himself, was safe from the retribution of others. His growing reputation for terror and efficiency made him both a figure of fear and a man constantly looking over his shoulder. His next move, however, would come as a result of the increasing complexity of the cartel wars. Rival cartels, seeing the influence of the Medellin cartel expand, began to retaliate. The violence between the cartels reached a new level, and Cifuentes would be forced to adapt. The bombmaker turned strategist, Cifuentes realized that while his previous attacks had been effective, the true power lay in something even more devastating, targeting the very foundation of his enemy's operations. He began to build bombs of unprecedented scale, devices that could not only destroy individuals or buildings but entire networks. This shift in approach demonstrated just how far Cifuentes had come in his understanding of power. It wasn't enough to merely strike fear into individuals. Now, he sought to break the very systems that allowed his enemies to thrive. And as the stakes grew higher, so did the risk. The more he succeeded, the more the walls around him seemed to close in. Cifuentes' transition from a street-level bombmaker to a strategic mastermind within the Medellin cartel was complete. With every successful bombing, his reputation grew, just as did the paranoia of his enemies. What began as an act of calculated destruction had turned into something far larger. His bombs, now symbols of fear, terror, and power, would go on to leave an indelible mark on Colombia's history. As Fernando Cifuentes solidified his position within the Medellin cartel, the world around him began to shift in ways that would have profound and dangerous consequences. He was no longer just a technician, a bombmaker crafting tools of destruction. He was now a central figure in the cartel's complex and ever-expanding network of violence and power. The Medellin cartel, under the iron grip of Pablo Escobar, was in the midst of its rapid rise to dominance, and the scope of its operations was becoming unimaginable. This wasn't just a drug empire, it was a global force, an entity that reshaped Colombia and the international criminal landscape. With his skill in explosives now recognized as essential to the cartel's operations, Cifuentes was trusted with increasingly complex and high-stakes tasks. His role was no longer limited to merely building bombs, he was now integral to the strategic planning of some of the cartel's most pivotal and lethal operations. The bombs he created were not just acts of vengeance or retaliation, they were designed to secure control, to eliminate threats, and, above all, to send a message. Each explosion was a carefully executed statement that resonated far beyond the immediate destruction it caused. The Medellin cartel was using fear as a weapon, and Cifuentes was its most reliable architect. The violence that had once been the hallmark of the cartel was intensifying. Rival factions, including the notorious Cali cartel and smaller, independent organizations, began to rise up in opposition, challenging Escobar's hegemony. The competition for control of drug routes, territories, and markets was fierce, and every day seemed to bring new bloodshed. The tension between the cartels escalated, and with it, the methods of warfare. Bombings were no longer isolated incidents or calculated acts of terror, they were strategic attacks aimed at breaking down the power structures of rival organizations. Cifuentes' bombs were the spearhead of this new kind of warfare, where violence wasn't just an expression of rage, but a highly methodical tool used for territorial dominance. His ability to carry out these attacks with near-perfect precision made him invaluable to the Medellin cartel. Cifuentes didn't just build explosives, he crafted messages. The bombings were not random acts of terror, they were designed to create psychological warfare. The cartel's enemies didn't just fear death, they feared the message behind each bomb. It wasn't just a building being destroyed or a rival gang member being eliminated, it was the collapse of an empire, the end of an era for a rival organization. Cifuentes understood the weight of this psychological warfare. The fear instilled by these acts was as valuable as the destruction itself. The precision with which Cifuentes carried out his work was unparalleled. Unlike many of the street-level bomb makers in the cartel, who relied on brute force and amateur tactics, he was a master of his craft. He understood not only how to construct explosives but how to position them for maximum effect. He was a perfectionist, taking great care to ensure that each device was designed with the end goal in mind, to cripple the cartel's enemies without fail. His ability to plant bombs that destroyed specific targets, whether it was a key leader, a supply route, or a strategic government building, made him a figure of both fear and admiration within the criminal world. This rising prominence within the Medellin cartel, however, was not without its complications. The more successful Cifuentes became in his role, the more attention he attracted, both from those within the cartel and from law enforcement. The Colombian government had long been aware of the cartel's operations, but the level of violence and sophistication had escalated to a point that it could no longer be ignored. The cartel's increasingly bold attacks were becoming a source of international outrage, and the Colombian government, along with its allies in the United States, began to take more aggressive steps to dismantle the Medellin cartel. For Cifuentes, this shift meant that he had to operate with even more caution and subtlety. His work, though crucial to the cartel's continued success, was becoming riskier by the day. The larger the cartel grew, the more enemies it made. The forces aligned against it were formidable, and those who had once been loyal allies now looked for ways to usurp Escobar's rule. Within the cartel, there were whispers of betrayal. Those who once shared in the spoils of the empire were now calculating how they could outmaneuver Escobar and take control of the cartel's lucrative operations. This internal struggle created a web of paranoia, and Cifuentes was no stranger to it. As a key player in the cartel's operations, Cifuentes found himself increasingly caught between the shifting tides of power. While his expertise was still highly valued, the very nature of his work, his ability to destabilize rival cartels and government institutions, had placed him in a precarious position. The Medellin cartel's leadership was fractured, and the loyalties of its various factions were in constant flux. Cifuentes, ever the pragmatist, understood that the survival of the cartel, and his own survival, depended on his ability to stay one step ahead of those who might turn against him. The level of violence that now defined the cartel's operations also had another consequence: it attracted the attention of Colombia's most powerful enemies. The U.S. government, which had long been tracking the flow of cocaine from Colombia, intensified its efforts to dismantle the cartel's operations. With the full support of the Colombian government, the United States launched a series of high-profile anti-drug campaigns, placing enormous pressure on the Medellin cartel. The government's tactics included everything from surveillance to raids to the use of military force, all of which made Cifuentes' work more difficult. The cartel's enemies were closing in, and the pressure on everyone involved in the cartel was reaching critical levels. As the heat on the cartel grew, so did the risks of Cifuentes' operations. He understood better than most that his bombs weren't just tools of destruction, they were his lifeline. They were his only means of maintaining control over a rapidly deteriorating situation. The explosions he orchestrated continued to strike fear into his enemies, but they also put a target on his back. It was no longer just rival cartels that sought his demise. The Colombian military, along with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, now had their sights set firmly on Cifuentes, the mastermind behind many of the most devastating bombings to ever hit Medellin. Cifuentes, however, was no stranger to danger. His rise within the cartel had come through a combination of cunning and an ability to read the rapidly changing political landscape. The world of the Medellin cartel was one of constant flux, and survival required not only physical skill but an ability to anticipate the shifting tides of power. As the situation around him grew more dire, Cifuentes remained focused on his work. He knew that in this world, power was fleeting, and that the only way to secure his place was to keep delivering results. It was during this period of intense pressure that Cifuentes' role within the cartel would take a more significant turn. While he had been instrumental in the Medellin cartel's internal operations, it was now clear that the cartel needed something more than just bombs. The escalating war with the Cali cartel, along with the increasing pressure from the Colombian government and the United States, meant that Escobar and his men needed to adapt quickly. The cartel's strategy was shifting, and with it, so too would Cifuentes' role in the coming battle for control. The stakes had never been higher, and Fernando, the fuse Cifuentes knew that the next moves he made could determine whether he would rise to the top, or become another casualty of the violence he had helped create. As the Colombian government, with the help of the United States, tightened its grip on the Medellin cartel, the entire organization began to feel the heat. For Fernando Cifuentes, the once steady rhythm of his work now seemed to carry an ominous undercurrent. The constant threat of capture or death loomed larger than ever, but this was a man who had built his reputation on working in the shadows, and it was in these very shadows that he thrived. Yet, with every successful bombing, Cifuentes knew that the stakes were rising, and the cartel's internal conflicts only made his position more precarious. Pablo Escobar, the charismatic and ruthless leader of the Medellin cartel, had built an empire based on terror, money, and, most importantly, control. However, as the authorities closed in, his once imposing structure began to show cracks. The cartel was more fragmented than ever, and loyalties were shifting. Escobar's actions, his bombings, assassinations, and public displays of power, had made him a national and international figure, but they also brought the world's scrutiny to bear on the cartel. The U.S. government, in particular, had begun to focus its attention on dismantling the cartel's operations, employing the full force of its intelligence, military, and law enforcement resources. The once untouchable empire that Escobar had built was now in danger of crumbling, and Cifuentes felt the pressure mounting on all sides. As the cartel's bombs became more strategic, Cifuentes found himself at the center of a larger and more dangerous game. The Medellin cartel, always a volatile force, was now engulfed in a full-scale war on multiple fronts. The violence was no longer confined to drug deals gone wrong or territory disputes, it was part of a larger political and social struggle. The cartel's war against the Colombian state escalated into an all-out battle for survival. Cifuentes, who had once been a master of creating fear through explosive violence, now realized that he was playing a much bigger role than he could have ever anticipated. The stakes were higher, and the people around him more unpredictable. Escobar's growing paranoia only deepened the atmosphere of distrust that permeated the cartel. In an empire built on fear, loyalty was always a fragile thing. The more desperate Escobar became, the more ruthless and erratic his decisions became. The Medellin cartel was now engaged in a complex war, fighting against not only rival cartels but also the entire government of Colombia and international law enforcement. This constant pressure caused tensions within the cartel, and Cifuentes, despite his strategic mind and usefulness, wasn't immune to the infighting and shifting alliances that now defined the organization. It was during this period that Cifuentes found himself being pulled in different directions. Escobar, whose iron-fisted control over the cartel was beginning to loosen, was increasingly focused on his own survival. His obsession with power made him unpredictable, and Cifuentes, ever the realist, began to understand that his loyalty to Escobar could only extend so far. While he had once considered himself an essential part of Escobar's vision, the larger reality of the situation was beginning to set in. Escobar's downfall was inevitable, and Cifuentes knew that, when that moment came, it would either mark the end of his career, or the beginning of a new and far more dangerous phase of his life. Despite these challenges, Cifuentes continued to rise within the cartel's ranks, becoming an indispensable figure for the operations of the Medellin cartel. He was now not just a bomb maker, but a strategist, someone who could influence the cartel's trajectory. His expertise in explosives had made him a key player in the cartel's ability to maintain its grip on power, but the world around him was shifting rapidly. The violence escalated, and Cifuentes' role evolved into something more intricate. While his bombs had once been used to target specific rivals, they now became tools for sending broader political messages. Cifuentes found himself not just aiding in the destruction of rivals but participating in the creation of a narrative of absolute power and unchecked authority. The Medellin cartel, at its peak, controlled much of the cocaine trade between Colombia and the United States, a highly profitable venture that fed the cartel's power. But the violence that came with this power was starting to take its toll. Escobar's attempts to bribe, intimidate, or destroy his way to absolute control were increasingly ineffective. The Colombian government, aided by the U.S., was slowly but surely closing in on Escobar's operation. The once feared leader of the Medellin cartel was now facing threats from all sides, and he had no choice but to escalate the violence even further. Escobar's desperation began to show, and this only made him more unpredictable. For Cifuentes, the escalation of violence meant that he had to adapt quickly. The once methodical approach to bomb-making had to evolve in response to the ever-changing dynamics of the cartel's war with the Colombian government and rival factions. He began to design bombs with greater sophistication, devices capable not only of destruction but of disrupting the very infrastructure that held his enemies together. These were no longer simple explosive devices aimed at causing chaos. They were calculated strikes meant to destabilize entire operations, to undermine the very foundations of the government's power. Cifuentes' bombs became symbols of defiance, each explosion a statement against the state's authority. In the midst of this growing chaos, Cifuentes' relationship with the cartel's leadership became more complicated. While his role as a bomb-maker and strategist continued to earn him respect and fear within the organization, he found himself caught in the middle of internal disputes and rivalries. The shift in leadership dynamics within the cartel created an environment of mistrust, and Cifuentes, always pragmatic, understood that his survival depended on his ability to navigate these shifting loyalties. The cartels were always one betrayal away from collapse, and the cracks in the Medellin cartel's armor were starting to show. Even as his reputation as a master of explosives continued to grow, Cifuentes knew that his life was hanging by a thread. The very power that he helped to create, the bombings that had cemented his place in the cartel, was also the thing that made him a target. Rival cartels, the Colombian government, and even factions within the Medellin cartel itself were all looking for ways to neutralize him. The more successful he became, the more exposed he was, and he began to feel the weight of the constant surveillance, the constant threats. As the war between the Medellin cartel and its enemies reached its climax, Cifuentes understood that his days of operating in the shadows were coming to an end. The cartel's power was waning, and with the increasing pressure from both the government and rival gangs, the inevitability of collapse seemed ever closer. The years of violence, manipulation, and fear were starting to take their toll on everyone involved. Cifuentes, though fiercely loyal to his craft and to the cartel that had given him power, knew that the world he had helped to create was beginning to fall apart. The final moments of Cifuentes' involvement in the Medellin cartel would be defined not only by the destruction he helped unleash but by the personal decisions he would have to make as the end of the cartel loomed. As the government and rival factions closed in, the decisions made in the coming months would seal his fate. Would he continue to fight, adapting to the changing circumstances, or would he leave the collapsing empire behind in search of a new life? As Fernando Cifuentes became a more integral part of the Medellin cartel's operations, the stakes grew exponentially. The cartel's internal dynamics were changing at an alarming rate, and even those closest to Pablo Escobar were beginning to question the direction the organization was taking. Escobar's obsession with maintaining his empire, his ego, his control, was pushing the cartel to ever more extreme methods. The level of violence escalated, but so did the paranoia, mistrust, and fear. It was a dangerous time for everyone involved, and Cifuentes, who had once felt invincible as the bomb mastermind, now found himself confronting the very real possibility of betrayal. Despite the increasing chaos around him, Cifuentes continued to play his role with precision. His bombs were becoming even more sophisticated, strategically placed not just for tactical advantage but for maximum psychological impact. Each bombing was a reminder of the cartel's power, its ability to strike fear into the hearts of its enemies, and its seemingly unassailable position in the drug trade. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, both within the cartel and in the global perception of its strength. Pablo Escobar's leadership had always been defined by his larger-than-life personality. To the world, he was the ruthless drug lord whose name inspired fear. To his allies and subordinates, however, he was both a savior and a tyrant. His wealth and power made him the most influential man in Colombia, but that very power was now being threatened by both external forces and internal discontent. Cifuentes, like many within the cartel, was acutely aware of the changing tides. The once unshakable loyalty to Escobar was beginning to fracture, and as the pressure on the cartel increased, the very people who had built Escobar's empire were beginning to look for ways out. The danger of infighting became more palpable every day, and Cifuentes, with his sharp mind and pragmatic approach, knew that survival was no longer guaranteed. The Colombian government, along with its U.S. allies, was tightening the noose around the Medellin cartel. Escobar's bravado and his penchant for flaunting his wealth and power had made him a global target. The cartel's operations, once largely confined to the shadows, were now in the spotlight, with law enforcement agencies and intelligence networks from around the world zeroing in on its members. For the first time, the cartel's wealth and ruthless tactics were no longer enough to protect them. The government's campaign against the cartel was intensifying, and as each day passed, the walls were closing in. Cifuentes, who had been part of the cartel's violent campaign against the state, now felt the consequences of those actions more personally. The net was tightening, and the fear of capture grew stronger. As the war between the Medellin cartel and the Colombian government escalated, the nature of Cifuentes' work began to change. The focus of the cartel's operations was no longer just about expanding its control over the drug trade. It was now a full-scale war, one that involved not just bombings and assassination attempts, but large-scale terror attacks. The attacks grew more brazen, more destructive, and more frequent. Cifuentes' bombs, once tools of targeted assassination and sabotage, were now part of a broader strategy of terror. The Medellin cartel had become a symbol of resistance, but also of chaos. And as the violence mounted, the international community began to take notice in ways it never had before. In the midst of this growing tension, Cifuentes found himself wrestling with his own role in the unfolding catastrophe. Though he had long been a loyal servant of the cartel, his increasing awareness of its fragility, its inability to adapt to the mounting pressure, began to make him question his future within the organization. Cifuentes had always been pragmatic, and as the pressure mounted, he started to see the collapse of the cartel as an inevitability. He had once been content with his role as a master bomb maker, an integral part of the Medellin cartel's military apparatus. But now, as the cartel teetered on the edge of collapse, he was faced with the prospect of being swept away in the chaos. Escobar's increasingly erratic behavior added to the growing instability. The leader's desperate attempts to stay in control, to maintain his empire, were taking a toll on those around him. The cartel's operations, once meticulously planned and executed, were now characterized by a sense of disarray. Escobar, consumed by his desire for power, became more isolated, and the paranoia that had defined his reign only intensified. Even as the cartel continued to strike fear into the hearts of its enemies, it was clear that its once solid foundation was beginning to crumble. As Cifuentes worked to adapt his operations to the changing landscape, he found himself dealing with a growing sense of isolation. He had once been an essential part of the cartel's strategy, but as the pressure on Escobar mounted, the dynamics within the organization shifted. The bonds that had once held the Medellin cartel together were now being tested. Cifuentes, who had survived by staying out of the spotlight and maintaining a low profile, began to question whether his survival was still assured. With the government and rival factions closing in, and with Escobar's grip on the cartel weakening, Cifuentes could no longer rely on the old strategies that had once kept him safe. The stakes were now higher than ever before. Escobar, in his desperation, was willing to take more extreme measures. The once tight control he had over his empire was slipping, and in his attempts to maintain dominance, he resorted to increasingly reckless actions. Cifuentes, ever the strategist, understood that the end of the cartel was fast approaching. The only question now was how he would navigate the collapsing empire and whether he would be able to survive the inevitable fallout. The decision was weighing heavily on him, and with each passing day, the possibility of betrayal, violence, and death loomed larger. The question of loyalty was becoming more complicated by the day. In an empire built on trust and violence, betrayal was always just around the corner. Cifuentes, who had spent years in the shadows, understood the fragility of loyalty in the world of organized crime. As the cartel's power began to wane, the likelihood of betrayal increased, and Cifuentes found himself asking whether the cartel was still worth fighting for. His loyalty to Escobar had always been driven by the mutual benefits of their partnership, but now, with the empire on the brink of collapse, that loyalty was being tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. Would he stay loyal to the cause that had brought him so much power? Or would he walk away before the final fall came, saving himself from the inevitable downfall? As the Medellin cartel's empire began to disintegrate, the last days of its reign were marked by an air of hopelessness, paranoia, and instability. Cifuentes, for all his brilliance in the art of bomb-making, knew that there was no longer a clear path forward. The end was near, and the choices he made in the coming weeks would determine not just his future, but his very survival. The question remained, would he stand by his brothers in arms until the very end, or would he choose to escape the storm and live to see another day? In this world, there was no easy answer, and for Cifuentes, the road ahead was fraught with peril. The situation for Fernando Cifuentes had become increasingly dire. As the Colombian government's crackdown on the Medellin cartel grew more aggressive, the environment within the cartel itself became a powder keg of tension. Escobar's reign, once a symbol of power and dominance, was now cracking under the pressure. His grandiose plans to secure his empire had turned into reckless decisions that alienated allies and invited even more scrutiny from the outside world. As the government, with its ever-tightening grip, closed in on his cartel, Cifuentes realized that he was no longer operating in the shadows with the same sense of invincibility that he once had. His position as the cartel's master bomb-maker, once an asset, now felt like a double-edged sword. The cartel, which had once run smoothly under Escobar's iron-fisted control, had now become a battlefield of egos, paranoia, and betrayals. Pablo Escobar, who had been the mastermind behind it all, had become a shadow of his former self. His desperation to hold on to power pushed him to make erratic and unpredictable moves. His once dependable allies were now questioning his decisions, and many of them feared the consequences of his actions. The loyalty that had once bound the cartel's members together was beginning to crumble, and the cracks in Escobar's leadership were becoming more and more apparent. Cifuentes, ever the pragmatist, saw the changing tides with a clarity that few others could. His role as the creator of the cartel's most feared weapon, the bomb, had made him indispensable to Escobar. His bombs had been used to destroy rival cartels, eliminate threats, and send powerful messages to the Colombian government. But as the cartel's fortunes began to turn, Cifuentes found himself in a precarious position. The same bombs that had made him a vital part of the operation were now becoming symbols of the cartel's desperation. Each blast, each explosion, was a reminder that the Medellin cartel was fighting a losing battle. Despite his growing concerns, Cifuentes continued to carry out his work with meticulous attention to detail. He was, after all, a master at what he did. His bombs were precise, powerful, and effective. But even as he perfected his craft, he couldn't ignore the growing instability around him. The walls were closing in, both from the Colombian government and from rival factions within the cartel. The once loyal men who had followed Escobar without question were now whispering behind his back, discussing how they might save themselves when the inevitable downfall came. Cifuentes knew that the cartel's end was near. Escobar's obsession with revenge, with making grand, violent statements to the world, had become an anchor dragging the entire operation under. The pressure from the government was relentless, and the public's hatred of the cartel was at an all-time high. Cifuentes, ever the realist, understood that Escobar's downfall would not only signal the collapse of the Medellin cartel but would also have devastating consequences for everyone involved. In this world, betrayal was just another part of the game. He had seen it happen too many times to ignore it now. The constant fear of capture had begun to take its toll on Cifuentes. Though he had always been careful, always stayed in the background, the ever-present danger of arrest or death loomed larger than ever. The days when he could work in relative anonymity were long gone. As the cartel's activities became more public, so did the search for its leaders. The authorities were tightening their noose, and every day brought with it new risks. Cifuentes had always been able to rely on his ability to move through the shadows, but now, even that felt like a luxury. As the government and rival cartels grew more aggressive, Cifuentes began to contemplate the unthinkable. Was it time to leave? Could he survive outside the cartel's protection, or had the world around him changed too much? Escobar, in his obsession with maintaining his power, was alienating those closest to him. His once loyal allies were now becoming liabilities, and Cifuentes knew that in this line of work, there was always a price to pay for loyalty. He had made it this far by knowing when to act and when to stay hidden, but with every day that passed, he felt the ground shifting beneath him. The war between the Medellin cartel and the Colombian government had reached a fever pitch. The government had escalated its efforts to dismantle the cartel, deploying specialized units, military personnel, and intelligence networks to track down its leaders. The cartels, in turn, had increased their violence, launching a series of brutal attacks on both the government and rival organizations. The once regimented operations of the cartel had given way to a chaotic and unpredictable form of warfare. The tactics had become more extreme, more desperate. Cifuentes, once a master of careful planning, now found himself in the middle of a full-scale war, one where the rules had changed. Each bombing, each attack, was now part of a larger strategy to destabilize the government and send a message that the cartel was still in control. But the truth was, the Medellin cartel's control was slipping away. What had once been a well-oiled machine was now a shadow of its former self. The more Cifuentes saw the chaos unfold, the more he understood that survival was now the only objective. The days of making bold, calculated moves were over. The cartel was now in full survival mode, and every decision, from planting bombs to deciding whom to trust, was tinged with the urgency of impending collapse. Escobar's obsession with his own legacy had led him down a dangerous path. He had once been a figure who could inspire fear and respect in equal measure, but now, he was a man isolated by his own actions. His erratic decisions, fueled by his paranoia and desire for revenge, had alienated many of his closest allies. The result was a fractured organization where loyalty was no longer guaranteed. Cifuentes, who had once been content to carry out his duties with the precision of a surgeon, now found himself questioning the very foundation of the cartel he had helped to build. Was it worth risking everything for a collapsing empire? Was the fight for survival still worth it when the very leader at the top was crumbling under pressure? In the midst of all this uncertainty, Cifuentes faced a critical decision. The cartel's future was uncertain, and his own future seemed even more precarious. He had built a life in the shadows, but now, those shadows were closing in. The choice before him was clear: continue to fight for a sinking ship, or make a break for freedom while he still had the chance. For a man like Cifuentes, who had lived and breathed the world of organized crime, this was no simple decision. The world he knew was one of loyalty, blood, and betrayal, things that were hard to walk away from. As the walls closed in on the Medellin cartel, the reality of the situation was undeniable: time was running out. Cifuentes could no longer remain an observer, watching from the sidelines. His role in the cartel, once so clear, was now clouded by uncertainty and danger. The choices he made in the coming weeks would determine not just his fate, but his place in history. Would he remain loyal to Escobar until the bitter end, or would he seek to carve out a new path for himself? Only time would tell, but for Cifuentes, the clock was ticking. As the war between the Medellin cartel and the Colombian government intensified, Fernando Cifuentes found himself at a crossroads. He had once been an indispensable part of the organization, the mastermind behind its most terrifying bombings, and a trusted member of Escobar's inner circle. But now, as the cartel's influence waned and the government's efforts to destroy it became more ruthless, Cifuentes could feel the grip of the empire he had helped build loosening. What had once been an environment of loyalty and brotherhood was now a landscape of fear, mistrust, and impending collapse. It was no longer just about the money or the power, it was about survival. Escobar, in his desperation, had become more erratic. His obsession with maintaining control over his empire blinded him to the changes taking place within his own organization. The once unified Medellin cartel was now a fractured group, with factions splintering off, allies turning against each other, and rivalries that had been simmering beneath the surface coming to a head. As Cifuentes navigated the treacherous waters of cartel politics, he had to weigh his options carefully. Loyalty to Escobar had brought him power and status, but loyalty was becoming a dangerous game to play. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about ensuring that he could live to see another day. The Colombian government, with its growing alliances with the U.S. and other international forces, was closing in on the cartel. The tactical advantage that Escobar had once enjoyed, being able to bribe, intimidate, and manipulate his way through law enforcement and political systems, was no longer enough. The government's operations became more precise, more coordinated, and more deadly. The walls were closing in on all sides, and every day the pressure mounted. For Cifuentes, who had always been a step ahead of the authorities, this new wave of coordinated attacks felt different. It wasn't just about staying hidden anymore, it was about making choices that would determine his fate. The sense of urgency that had always defined the cartel's operations now reached a fever pitch. Each bombing, each calculated attack on the government, felt like a last-ditch effort to cling to power. But as Cifuentes continued to play his role in these increasingly reckless attacks, he couldn't shake the feeling that the strategy was failing. What had once been a methodical, planned approach to warfare had now devolved into an endless cycle of violence and retribution. The cartel's actions, while still powerful, lacked the precision and focus they had once had. Escobar, in his need for revenge, was willing to sacrifice everything, including the very loyalty that had built his empire. The world outside the cartel's operations was watching with growing concern. The violence, the bombings, the assassinations, they were no longer just local events. The Medellin cartel's war with the government had become an international crisis, drawing attention from governments, media outlets, and human rights organizations around the world. The very existence of the cartel was now in jeopardy, and with it, the lives of everyone involved. Cifuentes, who had once felt untouchable, now felt the weight of that exposure bearing down on him. The public's opinion of the cartel had shifted, from seeing it as an unstoppable force to viewing it as a dying empire clinging to its last moments of power. The sympathy that the cartel had once enjoyed among the poor neighborhoods of Medellin was quickly evaporating as the violence spread, affecting not just the cartel's enemies but innocent civilians as well. For Cifuentes, the question of loyalty was no longer as clear-cut as it had once been. He had spent years serving Escobar, but now, as the cartel's downfall loomed closer, he began to wonder whether continuing to fight for the cartel was worth the risk. The reality was that survival was becoming more uncertain with every passing day. The government's crackdown had become so intense that even members of the cartel's inner circle were starting to turn on one another, willing to betray each other to save themselves. The loyalty that had once bound them together was now being tested in ways that had never been imagined. In a world built on trust and violence, betrayal was always lurking just beneath the surface. Cifuentes began to feel a shift in his perspective. The dangers of staying loyal to Escobar and the cartel were becoming increasingly clear. The explosion of violence, the uncertainty of their future, and the growing realization that the Medellin cartel was no longer invincible made Cifuentes question the cost of his loyalty. While his bond with Escobar had been one of power, respect, and fear, it was now becoming a bond of survival. Would continuing to follow Escobar to the bitter end guarantee his safety, or would it make him another casualty of the cartel's inevitable collapse? As he watched the growing chaos within the cartel, Cifuentes began to understand the gravity of the situation. The Medellin cartel was being consumed from within, and the violent tactics that had once served them so well were now creating more enemies than they could handle. The government's reach had expanded, and the cartel's ability to hide in the shadows was shrinking. The once unified front that had dominated the drug trade in Colombia was now splintering, and each faction within the cartel was vying for its own survival. Escobar, whose paranoia was at an all-time high, saw threats in every corner, and this fueled even more aggressive actions. The cartel was in a freefall, and with it, the people who had once been its closest allies. But for Cifuentes, it wasn't just about watching the destruction unfold, it was about choosing the right moment to step away, if that moment ever came. He had built his life in the shadows, moving silently and calculating every step. But now, the world had changed. The Medellin cartel's ability to operate with impunity was gone, and even the most trusted members were beginning to question whether it was worth it to remain part of the empire. The risks had never been higher, and as each day passed, the question of whether to remain loyal or walk away became more pressing. Escobar's increasingly irrational behavior made it clear that he was no longer the man Cifuentes had once respected. The leader's obsession with revenge and maintaining control had led him down a dangerous path, alienating allies and weakening the cartel's core. While Cifuentes had once relied on his role as Escobar's right-hand man, he now began to see that the man who had built the empire was no longer the same leader he had once followed. Escobar's desperate need for vengeance had turned him into a volatile figure, and Cifuentes, ever the pragmatist, could no longer ignore the fact that Escobar was a man on the edge of self-destruction. In this world of shifting alliances and growing instability, survival depended on making the right choices at the right time. And for Cifuentes, that meant preparing for the inevitable. The end of the cartel was no longer a question of if, but when. The only question that remained was whether he would survive the collapse, or whether he would be swept up in the tidal wave of violence and betrayal that was coming for them all. As the months passed and the walls around the Medellin cartel grew tighter, Fernando Cifuentes' sense of survival instincts kicked into overdrive. The government's military operations were relentless, and the cartel's ability to bribe or intimidate their way out of sticky situations was wearing thin. With each raid, with each new piece of intelligence uncovered by the authorities, the very structure of the cartel seemed to crumble a little further. The glory days of unchallenged power and wealth seemed to be slipping away faster than anyone had anticipated. Cifuentes, who had once felt invincible in his role as the cartel's master bomb maker, now found himself questioning his place in this dying empire. Pablo Escobar, despite his unwavering ego and determination to control every aspect of his world, was visibly breaking down. His paranoia had reached new heights, and those who had once served him without question were now beginning to speak in hushed tones about his increasingly erratic behavior. The loyalty that had once bound the men of the Medellin cartel together was dissolving, replaced by a sense of self-preservation. The bombings, the executions, the attacks, they were all part of Escobar's last-ditch efforts to prove that he was still in control, but they were no longer achieving the same results. His power was waning, and Cifuentes could see it all too clearly. In the face of this unraveling empire, Cifuentes found himself stuck in a delicate balancing act. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay under the radar, to keep his involvement in the cartel's operations hidden from the public eye. His work was strategic, precise, and, until recently, effective. But as the cartel grew more desperate and their operations became more chaotic, Cifuentes knew that it was only a matter of time before he too became a target. With the government closing in on the Medellin cartel from all sides, he had to decide whether to stay loyal to Escobar and risk being caught up in the cartel's inevitable collapse, or whether to break free and escape before it was too late. Cifuentes had always been a realist. He knew that loyalty in the world of organized crime could only stretch so far. He had seen firsthand how quickly alliances could shift when the stakes were high. The brutal violence that defined the Medellin cartel was no longer just a weapon against rivals and enemies, it was now a survival mechanism. Everyone was out for themselves. The men who had once been his comrades were now potential threats, each one looking for an opportunity to save their own skin. Escobar's loyalty, which had once been a source of strength, was now a liability. He had become too unpredictable, too dangerous, even for his closest allies. As the cartel's fate hung in the balance, Cifuentes faced a growing realization: he could not rely on Escobar forever. The man who had once been the king of Colombia was now fighting a losing battle against the Colombian government and his own diminishing power. With every failed attack, every attempt to assassinate a government official or rival leader, Escobar's grip on reality seemed to weaken. He had become consumed by his obsession with revenge, and that obsession had begun to cost him not just his empire but the loyalty of the men who had once revered him. Despite the chaos and the increasing danger, Cifuentes continued to carry out his duties as the cartel's bomb expert. He meticulously planned each attack, ensuring that the explosions were as devastating as possible. But even as he prepared each bomb, he couldn't shake the sense of inevitability that hovered over him. The Medellin cartel's days were numbered, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. With the government closing in and rival cartels sensing the cartel's weakness, the writing was on the wall. The end was near. But even as the end seemed inevitable, Cifuentes refused to give up. He had spent too many years building a life in the shadows, too many years perfecting his craft, to let it all go so easily. He had invested so much in the Medellin cartel, and while loyalty to Escobar was becoming a dangerous proposition, his survival instinct told him that it wasn't over yet. The cartel might be on the verge of collapse, but there were still opportunities to make his escape. There were still ways to navigate the shifting alliances, the chaos, and the violence in order to carve out a future for himself. In the days that followed, Cifuentes found himself growing increasingly cautious. The constant risk of being captured or killed had always been a part of the job, but now it felt more real than ever. The government's crackdown had become more intense, and each day brought with it new risks. The danger of betrayal, the fear of being turned over to the authorities by someone within the cartel, was a constant shadow hanging over him. He had always trusted his ability to remain in the background, to move unnoticed, but now that was no longer enough. The government was closing in on every angle, and the cartel's remaining strongholds were being systematically dismantled. The thought of leaving the cartel altogether began to take hold of Cifuentes. He had been loyal to Escobar for so long, but as the cartel's influence continued to wane, he began to question whether that loyalty was worth the cost. The Medellin cartel had once been a symbol of power and invincibility, but now it felt like a sinking ship. If he stayed, he risked being pulled down with it. If he left, he risked being marked as a traitor. Either way, his future was uncertain. One of the most troubling aspects of Cifuentes' situation was the realization that, in the end, he might be just another casualty of Escobar's destructive obsession with power. The cartel's collapse was not just a matter of law enforcement closing in, it was the result of years of reckless decisions, paranoia, and betrayal. Escobar had built his empire on a foundation of violence, but violence alone could not sustain it. Now, as the world he had built around him crumbled, Cifuentes saw the truth: loyalty, in this world, was a fleeting thing. The question wasn't whether Escobar could survive, it was whether any of them could. With the government's reach extending further and the rival cartels waiting for their moment to strike, Cifuentes was faced with a choice that no man in his position ever truly wanted to make. He could stay loyal to the cartel, continue his work, and risk everything, or he could break free and disappear into the shadows. His ability to choose his own fate, once a point of pride, had now become the most difficult decision of his life. But as he stood on the edge of a collapsing empire, one thing became clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The Medellin cartel, the organization that had once ruled the underworld, was now just a shadow of its former self. And Cifuentes, the mastermind behind its most terrifying attacks, now had to decide what his own future would look like as the empire he had helped build came crashing down around him. As the Medellin cartel continued to unravel, Fernando Cifuentes felt a profound shift in the environment around him. The once tightly knit structure of the organization held together by fear and loyalty, had now become a fragmented and chaotic system, teetering on the edge of collapse. The Colombian government's pursuit of Escobar and his associates was more relentless than ever, and the increasing isolation of the cartel's leaders meant that the stakes for everyone involved were higher than they had ever been before. As the forces of law and order tightened their grip on the cartel's operations, the very foundation of Cifuentes' existence began to feel fragile. The sense of paranoia that had always been a part of the cartel's world now began to consume the leadership, including Escobar. The man who had once been the most powerful drug lord in the world now found himself constantly watching over his shoulder, paranoid about betrayal from within his own ranks. The loyalty he had once commanded was slowly eroding, replaced by fear and self-preservation. Escobar's methods had worked for a time: bribery, violence, and ruthless intimidation, but now, even these tactics were beginning to falter. His leadership was no longer a source of respect but of fear, and as the days passed, it became increasingly clear that the cartel's time was running out. Cifuentes, ever the pragmatist, understood this better than anyone. He had spent his entire career in the shadows, carefully crafting explosives for the cartel's many attacks. His skill as a bomb maker had made him a valued asset, but it had also made him a target. The growing tension between the factions within the cartel only made things more dangerous. At any moment, someone could betray him, or worse, turn him over to the authorities in exchange for a lesser sentence. In this world, trust was a luxury few could afford. Every ally could become an enemy in an instant, and every move had to be calculated. One evening, as Cifuentes sat in a dimly lit safe house on the outskirts of Medellin, the full weight of the situation hit him. The cartel's operations were crumbling, their shipments disrupted, their finances dwindling. The people who had once been a tight-knit family were now divided and scrambling to secure their own futures. The streets of Medellin, once the base of their empire, were now swarming with soldiers and law enforcement officers, working with increasing efficiency to dismantle the cartel. There were whispers of rival cartels growing stronger, taking advantage of the Medellin cartel's faltering power. Even the small alliances that Escobar had managed to maintain with certain government officials were beginning to dissolve. The world that Cifuentes had known for so long was becoming increasingly unstable, and his position within it felt more precarious by the day. Cifuentes had been loyal to Escobar for years, and he had benefited greatly from that loyalty. His rise through the ranks of the cartel had been swift, but now he could no longer ignore the reality that Escobar's empire was crumbling. The man who had once been a kingpin, untouchable and feared, was now becoming more of a liability than an asset. His erratic decisions, fueled by desperation and paranoia, were pushing everyone around him into dangerous positions. As Escobar's leadership faltered, it became clear that the Medellin cartel was headed for a violent and tumultuous end. And yet, Cifuentes could not bring himself to sever ties with the organization completely. There was too much at stake, too many years invested in the cartel's rise to power. Despite the growing dangers, he still found himself working with the remnants of the cartel's operations, still carrying out the same meticulous bombings that had earned him his reputation. But each new mission, each new assignment, carried a sense of finality. The cartel's days were numbered, and everyone knew it. The question was no longer whether they would survive the government's crackdown, it was how many of them would make it out alive. In the midst of the escalating violence, Cifuentes began to see his role in the cartel from a different perspective. No longer just a tool of destruction, he began to understand the role of fear and uncertainty in maintaining control. His expertise in explosives had made him indispensable, but it had also made him a symbol of the cartel's relentless pursuit of violence. Bombings, attacks, and assassinations were no longer just about power, they were about sending a message. And as the cartel's grip on power loosened, that message was becoming less and less effective. The government, the people, and even rival cartels were growing more immune to the terror that the Medellin cartel had once used to control the streets. Despite this, Cifuentes continued to work behind the scenes, carrying out attacks and handling explosives with the same precision he had always used. He was still a master of his craft, and his reputation as a bomb maker remained intact, even as the world around him began to disintegrate. But the knowledge that his time with the cartel was limited weighed heavily on him. He knew that the cartel's days were numbered, and that the end of his involvement in its operations was drawing closer with each passing day. There were moments when Cifuentes considered leaving. The idea of escaping the cartel, of disappearing into the shadows and starting a new life, was tempting. But the risks of betrayal and capture were too great. The government was closing in, and anyone who tried to break away would be branded as a traitor. Cifuentes knew that the only way to survive was to play the game until the very end, to stay one step ahead of those who were coming for him. And yet, as the days wore on, Cifuentes could not shake the feeling that he was running out of time. His life, once filled with power, violence, and loyalty, was now a waiting game. The only question left was whether he could make it out alive when the inevitable collapse of the Medellin cartel finally arrived. The empire that had once been the most powerful criminal organization in the world was crumbling, and the fall of Escobar would soon follow. Cifuentes, who had once stood at the pinnacle of this empire, now found himself caught in the web of its destruction, uncertain of what the future would hold or whether he would live to see it. The tension in Medellin had reached its breaking point. Every day felt like a ticking clock, with the cartel members looking over their shoulders, wondering who would turn on them next. As the government's military operations advanced, and the law enforcement crackdown intensified, the streets of the city became a battleground. What had once been a thriving hub for the Medellin cartel now felt like a war zone. Cifuentes could feel the weight of the impending collapse, not just of the cartel, but of everything he had built his life around. The cracks in the organization had begun to show long before the government's assault escalated. While the top leaders, like Escobar, still clung to their delusions of control, those beneath them, people like Cifuentes, were facing the cold, hard reality of what was happening. The cartel's power was diminishing, and those who had once been loyal foot soldiers were now scrambling for their own survival. There were whispers of betrayal within the ranks, rumors of double crosses, of associates looking to escape the madness by making deals with rival cartels or even the authorities themselves. Cifuentes could hear the uncertainty in the voices of those around him. At the same time, the political landscape in Colombia was shifting. The government, led by President Cesar Gaviria, had launched a campaign to bring down the drug cartels once and for all. The U.S. government was heavily involved, providing support in the form of intelligence, military aid, and training. The pressure on Escobar and his organization was unprecedented. Cifuentes, however, was caught in a strange limbo. He had built a reputation as the cartel's most effective bomb maker, a man capable of causing unimaginable destruction with his carefully crafted devices. But in the midst of all the chaos, the role he had once taken such pride in now seemed more like a curse. His explosives, which had once served as tools of power, were now a constant reminder of the destruction that was closing in on him. The paradox of Cifuentes' position was that, even though the cartel was crumbling, he still found himself deeply invested in its survival. He had spent years building his expertise, perfecting his craft, and ensuring that his work was essential to the cartel's operations. He had become too valuable to let go, too deeply embedded in the cartel's network of violence and fear. But as the authorities closed in and the rival cartels began to circle, Cifuentes found himself increasingly trapped. There was no escaping the growing sense of doom that hung over Medellin. Every explosion, every assassination, every ambush only seemed to push the cartel closer to its final reckoning. And yet, even as he executed these deadly operations, Cifuentes couldn't help but feel a sense of detachment. The bombs he planted, the lives they took, had all been part of the grand scheme of power and violence that had built the Medellin cartel into the global force it had been. But now, as the world around him crumbled, it was hard to see how it all fit together anymore. What had once seemed like a winning formula, terror, control, and absolute dominance, had been shattered. The empire was disintegrating, and Cifuentes was left to pick through the ruins, unsure of what to do next. Escobar's paranoia was another factor that made survival within the cartel even more difficult. His erratic behavior had made him a liability to his closest allies. Cifuentes had been close enough to witness the changes in Escobar over the past months. The man who had once been a brilliant strategist, someone who had mastered the art of manipulation and power, had now become a shadow of himself. His decisions were increasingly reckless, driven by fear and desperation. It was clear to Cifuentes that Escobar's mental state was deteriorating, and with it, the stability of the cartel. As the cartel's remaining strongholds in Medellin came under siege, the leadership began to fracture. Escobar was no longer the unchallenged kingpin who could hold everything together. His closest confidants, men who had once sworn loyalty to him, were now questioning his judgment. The cartel had been built on a foundation of ruthless violence and unchecked ambition, but now that foundation was crumbling. The men who had once been willing to die for Escobar were now looking for a way out. The power dynamics were shifting, and Cifuentes found himself facing a dilemma he had never anticipated. For Cifuentes, there was no clear path forward. On one hand, he had always been loyal to Escobar, and loyalty was something that ran deep in the world of organized crime. But on the other hand, he knew that the cartel's days were numbered. Even if Escobar somehow managed to survive, the cartel would never return to its former glory. The government's crackdown was too effective, the rival cartels were too powerful, and the internal cracks were too deep. It was only a matter of time before the entire structure came crashing down. In the midst of all this turmoil, Cifuentes faced an internal struggle. He had spent his entire adult life in the service of the cartel, and in some ways, it had become a part of him. But now, as he watched the empire he had helped build crumble, he began to question everything he had done. The violence, the betrayal, the manipulation, it was all starting to feel like a losing game. He had been a cog in a much larger machine, one that was now spiraling toward its inevitable destruction. And yet, despite everything, Cifuentes could not bring himself to walk away completely. The fear of retribution, the sense of duty, and the sheer weight of his involvement kept him tethered to the cartel even as it hurtled toward its final days. The explosions continued. Each blast seemed to signal the end of an era, but there was still work to be done. The cartel needed to make its last stand, to show that it was not ready to go quietly into the night. For Cifuentes, each operation was both a reminder of his skill and a reminder of the end that was coming. He knew that the Medellin cartel would never rise again, and yet he still found himself driven by the same instincts that had guided him all these years. Survival, after all, was all that mattered now. In the end, the only thing Cifuentes could do was keep moving forward. He had no illusions about the future. The cartel was done, Escobar was doomed, and his own fate was uncertain. But for now, there were still bombs to make, still targets to hit. The clock was ticking, and the days of the Medellin cartel were numbered, but Fernando Cifuentes would not go quietly into the shadows just yet. As the cartel's empire teetered on the edge of collapse, Fernando Cifuentes found himself grappling with a new reality, one that was no longer defined by the power and fear that had once permeated his every action. The Medellin cartel, once a behemoth that controlled the flow of cocaine across continents, was now reduced to a fractured collection of men and women scrambling to preserve their lives and, if possible, their loyalty to the very man who had led them to dominance. In the midst of this unraveling, Cifuentes knew that survival was not only about physical safety but also about navigating the shifting alliances and threats that were multiplying every day. Pablo Escobar, whose name had once commanded awe and terror throughout the underworld, was now a man cornered. His fortress, the luxury prison La Catedral, had once seemed like a symbol of his invincibility. But now, with government forces and rival cartels closing in, it was little more than a gilded cage, a temporary respite from the inevitable. The vast resources that had once enabled Escobar to buy politicians, police officers, and entire neighborhoods now seemed inadequate in the face of the overwhelming pressure that he was under. Cifuentes, who had once revered Escobar as a mastermind and a protector, now saw him as a man at war with his own demons, a man who had become increasingly unpredictable as the walls around him tightened. The cartel's operations were becoming harder to sustain. Colombia's military and law enforcement, bolstered by U.S. intelligence and technology, had begun to dismantle the cartel's infrastructure with precision. The strategic locations that once served as safehouses, warehouses, and distribution points were now being raided with alarming regularity. The once expansive network of loyal allies that the cartel had cultivated was disintegrating, as the realization set in that loyalty to Escobar was no longer a ticket to safety, but rather a death sentence. The men and women who had once carried out the cartel's orders with unwavering devotion now had to ask themselves the harshest question of all: was it worth it? For Cifuentes, the answer was becoming less and less clear. His reputation as the cartel's top bomb maker had ensured his survival for years. His expertise in explosives had allowed him to carry out some of the most devastating and precise attacks in the history of organized crime. But as the cartel's internal instability deepened and the government's siege grew fiercer, Cifuentes began to wonder if his skill set would even matter in the end. His bombs had once served as symbols of the cartel's power and reach, but now they felt more like the tools of a dying organization, desperately lashing out at its inevitable demise. The final days of the Medellin cartel were marked by an eerie sense of disillusionment. The men and women who had once reveled in the wealth and power that came with their association to Escobar were now questioning their choices. Some had already begun making plans to flee, knowing that the end was near. The government had made it clear that no one would be spared, no matter their role within the organization. Cifuentes himself, having seen the writing on the wall, found himself at a crossroads. His loyalty to the cartel had once been unshakable, but now he was questioning if it was worth clinging to a sinking ship. As the cartel's grip on Colombia weakened, the danger grew more personal. Betrayals were becoming commonplace. Men who had once sworn an oath of loyalty to Escobar were now turning on him, eager to save themselves from the storm that was rapidly approaching. These betrayals were not just limited to those on the outside. Cifuentes had seen firsthand how paranoia had infected the leadership, how Escobar's closest allies had begun to fear that their loyalty would be their downfall. In a world built on the foundation of loyalty, trust had become a luxury few could afford. In a moment of deep reflection, Cifuentes began to wonder if his own name would soon be added to the list of those who would be left behind or sold out. But even as the cartel's empire collapsed, Cifuentes remained tethered to his role as the bomb maker. There was a certain finality to his work now. Every explosive he crafted, every mission he carried out, felt like the last act in a doomed drama. The bombs he planted were no longer just about power or control, they were an attempt to hold on to something, anything, that reminded him of the world he had known. Each mission, each explosion, was an echo of the glory days, a reminder of the empire that was no more. But these small victories felt increasingly hollow as the days passed. In the midst of the destruction, new, more dangerous reality began to set in. The rival cartels were growing bolder. As the Medellin cartel's power waned, other criminal organizations were moving in, ready to claim the spoils. The Cali cartel, once a rival and a shadow to Medellin's dominance, was now positioned to take control of the cocaine trade. Their tactics were different from Escobar's, more subtle, more strategic, but just as deadly. The war for control of the drug trade in Colombia was intensifying, and Cifuentes, caught in the middle, could not ignore the growing threat from every direction. The external enemies were no longer just law enforcement and the government. The rival cartels were a very real danger, and as the Medellin cartel's once loyal soldiers began to defect or disappear, it was clear that survival meant adapting to a new set of rules. The city of Medellin itself seemed to reflect the disintegration of the cartel. What had once been a city under the control of Escobar was now a place of constant turmoil, as both the government and rival cartels fought for dominance. The streets that had been the backbone of the cartel's operations were now the battlegrounds where lives were lost daily. The violence, once carefully orchestrated, had now become reckless and indiscriminate. No one was safe, not even the most trusted members of the cartel. The rules had changed, and for men like Cifuentes, the realization came too late. In the face of this new reality, Cifuentes was forced to confront the truth of his situation. His days as a trusted member of the Medellin cartel were coming to an end. The loyalty that had once made him indispensable was now a liability. The future, uncertain and dangerous, stretched out before him. There were no guarantees. Escobar's empire was crumbling, and soon, all that would be left were the ruins of a once great criminal dynasty. The situation in Medellin had reached a fever pitch. Fernando Cifuentes, once the feared bomb maker of the Medellin cartel, was now facing an uncertain and perilous future. With the collapse of the cartel's power structure, the destruction of Escobar's leadership, and the government's relentless pursuit of the remaining members, the world Cifuentes had known was no longer recognizable. The city, once thriving on the blood-stained wealth of the drug trade, now felt like a graveyard for a past era. Cifuentes had spent much of his life in the shadows, carefully crafting explosive devices that had become symbols of the cartel's brutal power. Each bomb he created was a tool of intimidation, a signature of the Medellin cartel's reach. His expertise in explosives had earned him not only the respect but also the fear of his peers. But as the government's military operations escalated, and the rival cartels drew closer to seizing control, even Cifuentes found himself questioning the very foundation of his existence. What had it all been for? What was left now? The Medellin cartel was no longer the impenetrable fortress it once was. Once, Escobar's cartel had ruled with an iron fist, manipulating the political and social landscape of Colombia, evading capture by both the government and international authorities. Now, those very authorities were closing in, forcing those loyal to Escobar to flee or surrender. There were still pockets of resistance, remnants of the once mighty cartel, but they were increasingly isolated, surrounded by enemies on all sides. The military had become a shadow over Medellin, its presence as oppressive as the cartels had once been. The city, a hub for cocaine production and trafficking, now felt like a battlefield where old alliances were being torn apart by the march of time and power. The fear was palpable, and yet, amid this growing chaos, the question of loyalty remained one of the few things that still had meaning. For Cifuentes, loyalty had always been everything. His loyalty to Pablo Escobar had guided him, shaped him, and secured his place in the cartel's ranks. It was what had made him such a valuable asset to the organization. But as Escobar's power dwindled, so too did the bonds of loyalty that had once been absolute. Cifuentes could see that the loyalty that had built the cartel was now becoming a dangerous liability. With Escobar's paranoia reaching new heights, every interaction, every move, was now tainted with suspicion. Even the most trusted members of the cartel were beginning to fear that their loyalty to Escobar might cost them their lives. As the walls closed in, Cifuentes found himself caught in a brutal game of survival. His skills, once indispensable, were now a double-edged sword. The same bombs that had been used to assert control over rival cartels and government forces were now part of a dying cause. Cifuentes could not escape the brutal irony. His ability to craft devastating explosives, the very talent that had elevated him within the cartel, was now part of the reason the Medellin cartel was collapsing. Each explosion, once a signature of dominance, had become an echo of destruction, both literal and figurative. In these final days of the cartel, the internal collapse was mirrored by a shifting balance of power on the streets. The rise of the Cali cartel was not just a threat to Escobar's empire, it was a harbinger of a new era in the Colombian drug trade. The Cali cartel's methods were different, more discreet, more sophisticated, but their rise was inevitable. They had spent years building their empire quietly, using influence and strategy rather than sheer violence. The Medellin cartel had relied on terror and spectacle to maintain control, but the world had changed. As the Colombian government, backed by the U.S. military and intelligence agencies, began to push harder, the strategy of violence was proving ineffective. Escobar's old ways of doing business were being outpaced by newer, more efficient criminal networks. In the final days of the Medellin cartel's dominance, Cifuentes found himself with few options. He could remain loyal to the crumbling organization and risk being swept up in its downfall, or he could attempt to flee, to disappear into the shadows and hope to evade the consequences of his past. But there were no easy answers. The world of organized crime was one where loyalty could either ensure survival or lead to a brutal end. As Cifuentes looked around, he saw that the very men he had once trusted were now either dead, missing, or on the run. Those who remained were either too scared to fight or too paranoid to trust anyone. The question of survival was now the central concern for everyone in Medellin, and for Cifuentes, it became a matter of whether he could escape the trap he had helped create. He had spent years in the service of the cartel, but as the final chapter of the Medellin cartel was written, it became clear that no one would come out unscathed. Even the strongest men, the most loyal soldiers, were not immune to the inevitable tide of violence that had claimed so many before them. In the world of the drug trade, there was no room for weakness, no place for those who faltered. Despite his fear, Cifuentes could not help but reflect on the legacy of the Medellin cartel. It was an empire built on blood, fear, and ambition, but it had also created something undeniably powerful. The cartel had reshaped the global drug trade and had elevated its leaders to the status of legends. The names of those who had been a part of it, Escobar, Cifuentes, and others, would be forever etched in history, not as ordinary criminals but as titans who had built a criminal empire that had changed the course of history. But now, as he watched the empire crumble around him, Cifuentes couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. What had it all been for? Was it worth it? The wealth, the power, the fear, was it enough to justify the destruction it had caused? The once glamorous world of the Medellin cartel had left nothing but a wake of devastation in its path. For Cifuentes, the answer was as elusive as ever. What was left now? The future seemed like an empty void, and yet, he couldn't help but feel the pull of the past. The work he had done, the skill he had honed, had been part of something greater, something that had once been unstoppable. But now, even that felt like a distant memory. As the last days of the cartel dragged on, the only thing that seemed certain was that the world Cifuentes had known was gone. There would be no redemption, no second chance. The Medellin cartel had run its course, and so too had the men who had brought it to power. For Fernando Cifuentes, the end was inevitable. And yet, he still found himself bound to the past, to the choices he had made. The future might be uncertain, but in the final days, all he could do was survive, until the last explosion went off. As Fernando Cifuentes stood in the shadow of what had once been the powerful empire of the Medellin cartel, the weight of his decisions seemed almost unbearable. The streets of Medellin, once a sprawling network of illicit trade and hidden wealth, now felt like a labyrinth of ghosts. The echoes of the old world, a world he had helped build, were fading quickly. Cifuentes could hear the distant sounds of sirens and helicopters in the sky, a constant reminder that the collapse of the cartel was not just a matter of time, it was a living, breathing reality, one that surrounded him like the air he breathed. His mind wandered back to the earlier days of his involvement with the cartel, to the days when everything seemed possible. In the early years, his role as the bomb maker had earned him a reputation for precision and fearlessness. He had been known for creating devices so deadly and accurate that even rival cartel leaders had come to respect his work. But that was before the paranoia set in, before Escobar's grip on the empire began to slip. Back then, there was purpose in everything, every task, every mission. The cartel was a well-oiled machine, running with ruthless efficiency, powered by money, fear, and loyalty. But that machine had begun to break down, and as it did, so too did the world Cifuentes had come to depend on. His skill set, once highly valued, now felt like a relic of a bygone era. The bombs he crafted, designed to instill terror and secure power, had lost their impact. As the government forces closed in, as rival cartels took advantage of the void left by Medellin's decline, the explosive devices were no longer just symbols of strength, they were desperate, last-ditch efforts to hold on to something that was slipping away. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him. He had always believed in the mission of the cartel, or at least, in the sense of order it provided in a chaotic world. Escobar, despite his madness, had been a master of control, at least, at first. He had crafted a network so vast and intricate that it seemed impervious to the forces trying to destroy it. But like all empires built on corruption and violence, it had its flaws, and those flaws were now emerging with brutal clarity. Cifuentes knew that the end was inevitable, but what he could not reconcile was how quickly everything had fallen apart. One day, they were untouchable, the rulers of an empire that spanned continents. The next, they were scattered, hunted by their enemies, their former allies, and even their own government. Loyalty had always been the foundation of the cartel's operations, but as the cracks in the organization began to widen, loyalty was no longer a guarantee of safety. Paranoia spread like a virus, infecting even the most trusted members of the cartel. There was a particular moment that haunted Cifuentes, one that seemed to encapsulate the essence of the cartel's demise. It was the night when Escobar, in a fit of rage and distrust, had ordered the execution of one of his most trusted lieutenants. The man had been with Escobar since the very beginning, helping him rise from a small-time smuggler to the most powerful drug lord the world had ever known. But in Escobar's eyes, loyalty was a fleeting thing, one that could be taken for granted. The lieutenant's crime had been simple: he had made a mistake, a miscalculation in one of the cartel's operations. In the old days, Escobar might have overlooked the error, accepting it as part of the risks of doing business. But these were not the old days, and Escobar was not the man he once was. The lieutenant's death was swift, brutal, and symbolic. It was a message: no one was safe, not even the ones closest to him. For Cifuentes, that moment had been a turning point. He had watched the blood spill, seen the life drain from a man who had been part of the cartel's very foundation, and he realized something that he had refused to acknowledge for years: no one, no matter how loyal, was irreplaceable. Escobar had been willing to sacrifice anyone, including his closest allies, for the sake of maintaining control. In the world of the cartel, loyalty was nothing more than a currency, one that was worth exactly as much as the man who held it in his hands. And as Escobar's grip on the empire loosened, that currency was rapidly devaluing. Now, as Cifuentes walked through the decaying remnants of Medellin's underworld, the streets that had once been teeming with life and illicit trade felt desolate. The once bustling neighborhoods where money changed hands and deals were made in shadowy corners were now ghost towns, abandoned in the wake of the cartel's disintegration. Even the few loyalists who remained seemed to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. Fear, more than anything, seemed to permeate the air. Cifuentes could not escape the growing sense of inevitability that followed him everywhere. There was no turning back now. The years of loyalty to Escobar and the cartel had brought him wealth, power, and a reputation that had made him untouchable in the eyes of many. But those same years had also made him a target, both for the Colombian government and for the rival cartels that were eager to claim Medellin's throne. The silence between the explosive detonations felt deafening now, as though even the earth itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the final blow. In those final days, survival became the most important goal. Cifuentes had no illusions about his future. He had seen the writing on the wall long ago, understood that the Medellin cartel's days were numbered. The government was closing in, the rival cartels were growing bolder, and even the loyal members of the cartel were becoming increasingly distrustful of one another. The world Cifuentes had helped create was falling apart, and there was no place for men like him in the future that was unfolding. But even in the face of such uncertainty, Cifuentes could not completely let go of the past. His memories, like his bombs, were remnants of a world that no longer existed. The riches, the power, the fear, it all felt so distant now, like a dream fading with the dawn. Yet, there was a part of him that longed for that world, even as he knew it was slipping away. Perhaps, he wondered, it was the price of a lifetime spent in the shadows, to always long for something you could never truly have, and to see that longing destroyed before your very eyes. With each passing day, the streets grew quieter, the shadows longer. The final chapter of the Medellin cartel was being written, and Cifuentes could feel the ink drying on his own story. There would be no heroic end, no grand escape. The world he had known was dying, and with it, the man he had been. What would be left of him when the dust finally settled? The man who had been feared and respected was now just another ghost, walking through the ruins of his own empire, wondering if he had ever truly understood the cost of the life he had chosen. As Fernando Cifuentes navigated the chaos in the final days of the Medellin cartel, he was confronted with a reality he had long avoided: his empire, built on violence and fear, was crumbling before his eyes. The government, strengthened by international support, was tightening its grip on Colombia. It was not just the military or rival cartels that posed a threat, but the overwhelming power of the state itself, backed by intelligence networks from the U.S. and beyond. Even Escobar, who had once seemed untouchable, was feeling the heat of the pursuit, and with his fall imminent, the fate of those loyal to him was sealed in uncertainty. For Cifuentes, survival had always been a calculated matter. He had spent years hiding in plain sight, playing a dangerous game of trust and betrayal, building a reputation that was as much about stealth as it was about violence. His knowledge of explosives made him invaluable, but as the walls closed in, it became clear that the very skills that had once granted him access to the heights of cartel power were now a heavy burden. The explosions, the carefully orchestrated bombings, the reign of terror that had once established the Medellin cartel's dominance, all seemed like echoes of a time long past. His bombs, which had sent waves of fear through Colombia and the world, now felt like relics of a dying age. And yet, it wasn't just the bombs that had made Cifuentes feared, it was his position within the cartel, his proximity to Escobar, and the immense power he had wielded through his loyalty and skill. But loyalty, like everything else in the world of the Medellin cartel, had a price, and that price was becoming clear to Cifuentes. The world of organized crime, particularly at the level that Escobar had operated, was founded on a kind of brutal honesty. Survival was paramount, and every relationship had an expiration date. For Cifuentes, that date had arrived. He could feel the shift, the cracks in the cartel's foundation growing wider by the day. The alliances he had forged with his fellow bombmakers, his loyal associates, were now fraying under the pressure of a collapsing empire. Trust was a luxury no one could afford, and even the most loyal men were now questioning whether their past associations with the cartel would lead to their survival or their downfall. In these final days, the streets of Medellin, once the stage for lavish displays of power and wealth, now felt like a battleground. Gunfire echoed through the night, and the once bustling neighborhoods were now shadows of their former selves. The city was on the brink of collapse, both economically and socially. The government forces, bolstered by U.S. military aid, had taken control of large portions of the city, pushing out cartel influence in a manner that felt almost surgical. Escobar, once the most powerful man in Colombia, was now being hunted like a wild animal. His closest allies, including Cifuentes, were now either in hiding or attempting to flee the country. The streets that had once been filled with luxury cars and expensive clothing were now filled with fear, confusion, and the desperate flight of those who had once held all the power. As the months dragged on and the walls continued to close in, Cifuentes found himself increasingly isolated. There were no longer safe houses to retreat to, no allies to rely on. The men who had once fought beside him were either dead, captured, or scattered to the wind. Even the cartel's vast wealth, which had once been its greatest strength, was now nothing more than a fading memory. The banks had frozen their accounts, the properties had been seized, and the money that had flowed so freely was now either hidden or lost. The empire that had once seemed invincible was now little more than a house of cards, collapsing under the weight of its own greed and ambition. But Cifuentes was not one to surrender easily. The fire that had once driven him to greatness, the ambition that had pushed him to rise from the slums of Medellin to the ranks of Escobar's inner circle, still burned within him. Even as the odds stacked higher against him, he knew that there were always options, always ways to survive, if you were willing to take risks and make the right choices. But with each passing day, the options became fewer, and the consequences of every decision became more severe. Cifuentes' dilemma was clear: he could remain loyal to the ideals that had once guided him, or he could betray everything he had known in order to save himself. The men around him were faced with the same decision. Would they remain steadfast in their allegiance to Escobar and the Medellin cartel, or would they abandon ship and seek out new opportunities with other criminal organizations or government forces? In the world of organized crime, there were no easy answers, no guarantees. Loyalty was both a strength and a liability, depending on the situation. For Cifuentes, it was becoming increasingly difficult to discern which was which. The military operations in Colombia continued to intensify, and soon the focus shifted from just the Medellin cartel to all organized crime in the region. The government had declared war on the drug cartels, and every corner of the country felt the impact of this decision. The military conducted sweeps through Medellin, looking for any remaining cartel members, seizing whatever assets they could find, and making arrests wherever possible. Escobar, realizing that his days were numbered, retreated into hiding, relying on a small group of loyalists to protect him. Cifuentes, once one of those loyalists, knew that his time was running out. It was then that the true horror of the situation set in for Cifuentes. Escobar's empire was not just falling apart, it was being obliterated, piece by piece. The cartel's once formidable network was disintegrating under the weight of law enforcement pressure, and the loyalty that had once been the backbone of the organization was now being replaced by fear. The men who had once sworn to fight and die for Escobar were now seeking deals with the government, hoping to save themselves by providing intelligence or turning on their former allies. As the fallout from the Medellin cartel's collapse intensified, Fernando Cifuentes found himself submerged in a relentless storm of uncertainty. The days when he had been one of the most feared figures in Colombia, celebrated and feared in equal measure for his explosive expertise, seemed like a distant memory. In the wake of Escobar's death, everything had changed: political alliances, rivalries, and the very nature of power itself. The once imposing empire that had brought terror to the streets of Medellin and beyond was now a shadow, a crumbling edifice of shattered dreams and violent memories. Cifuentes, however, was not one to give up easily. He had survived the rise of the Medellin cartel, the reign of Escobar, and countless betrayals from within. He had weathered the explosive bursts of violence that had defined his career, always emerging from the ashes, albeit scarred. But now, in the vacuum left by Escobar's death, the stakes were higher than ever, and survival was a far more delicate art. It was no longer about outsmarting rivals or fighting for supremacy, it was about navigating a world that no longer operated by the same rules. The first signs of the changing times had become clear in the immediate aftermath of Escobar's death. With the Medellin cartel in disarray, the Colombian government, bolstered by international support, launched a concerted campaign to eliminate any remaining pockets of cartel influence. The once impenetrable network of safe houses, hidden assets, and loyalists had crumbled. As the remnants of the cartel's leadership scattered, Cifuentes was forced into hiding, his every movement tracked by authorities. The military, once the enemy of Escobar's organization, was now a threat to everyone who had been part of the empire's inner circle. Cifuentes had always been cautious, a man who understood the value of subtlety and discretion. His work in explosives had earned him a reputation as a master of destruction, but he was no fool. He knew that as the pressure mounted, the opportunities for survival would become fewer, and every choice would carry the weight of potentially catastrophic consequences. His survival instincts, honed over years of navigating the deadly game of cartel politics, kicked into overdrive. He began to move through the shadows, careful to avoid the watchful eyes of both law enforcement and his former colleagues, many of whom were now more dangerous than ever. It was during these months of hiding that Cifuentes began to confront a deeper, more personal question: what had all of this been for? What had he sacrificed, and for whom? The Medellin cartel, in its heyday, had offered a kind of power that was intoxicating. It had given him a sense of purpose, a place in the world. But now, as he moved from one temporary refuge to another, he realized that power had always been fleeting. In the face of the government's relentless pursuit and the growing threat of rival cartels like the Cali cartel, the empire that had once seemed invincible was now just a collection of fading memories. But there was something else Cifuentes had to reckon with: the toll that his life of crime had taken on his own conscience. For so long, he had been driven by the thrill of his work, the adrenaline of executing high-stakes missions, and the satisfaction of being indispensable to Escobar. But now, those same memories felt like an albatross around his neck. He had seen too many friends and allies fall, their bodies left behind in the bloody wake of their ambitions. His own hands were stained with the blood of countless victims, innocent lives lost in the wake of his deadly craft. In the solitude of his hiding, Cifuentes couldn't escape the harsh truths that had begun to cloud his thoughts. His fame, his skills, the things that had made him a legend within the cartel, now seemed like hollow markers of a past that had been washed away by the tides of time. The world he had once inhabited, one of loyalty and ruthless ambition, was gone. And with it, the illusions that had sustained him for so long began to dissolve. Cifuentes had been deeply loyal to Pablo Escobar, and for that loyalty, he had paid a heavy price. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that loyalty, in the world they had inhabited, was not always a virtue. It was a tool, a weapon used to bind people to causes that were ultimately destructive. It was a force that kept them in the game, even when it was clear that the game had no winners. And yet, even in this moment of reckoning, when all the glamour and power had faded into nothingness, Cifuentes found it difficult to let go. Perhaps it was the same instinct that had kept him alive for so long, the will to survive, to fight, to hold on to what little he had left. But as the days passed, the reality of his situation became more undeniable. The man who had once orchestrated bombings with the precision of an artist now found himself fighting for his own life in a world that had no place for him. With the government closing in, Cifuentes knew he could no longer hide indefinitely. The pressure was mounting, and with each passing day, the noose tightened around him. He had to act. But what could he do? The alliances that had once provided him with support were either gone or no longer viable. He had no choice but to move, to take what little he had left and find a way out of Colombia. But escaping the grip of the authorities and the cartel alike would not be easy. The same skills that had once made him a master of destruction were now the tools he would have to use to survive. The irony was not lost on him. The very skills that had brought him success, the bombs, the chaos, the fear, were now his greatest liabilities. The world he had helped create was collapsing, and now he was just another casualty of the game. But there was one thing that Cifuentes still had, his knowledge. He had always been one step ahead, a man who understood the intricacies of power in a way that few others did. And if there was one thing that still gave him hope, it was the possibility that he could use that knowledge to escape, to find a way out of the trap he had helped build. The next few weeks would be a blur of movement, of constant fear and uncertainty. But Cifuentes would not be caught unprepared. His mind, sharp as ever, began to piece together a plan that would take him far from Colombia, to a place where he could rebuild, where he could disappear. He knew the risks, the dangers, but he also knew that his survival depended on one thing, staying ahead of those who were hunting him. And for Cifuentes, that had always been the game, the only game he knew how to play. As he prepared to leave the country, Cifuentes couldn't help but reflect on the man he had become. His life, once defined by ambition and the pursuit of power, had now become a tale of survival. The man who had once lived for the rush of violence and control now found himself seeking refuge in the shadows, his future uncertain, his past a heavy burden. The Medellin cartel may have been destroyed, but the legacy it had left behind, one of blood, destruction, and betrayal, would follow him for the rest of his days. Cifuentes moved through the shadows with a sense of urgency, the weight of his past closing in on him with every step. The streets of Medellin, once teeming with life, now felt hollow, almost haunted. The echoes of gunfire, the roaring engines of cartel convoys, the frantic hustle of drug deals, all of it seemed like a distant memory. The war, the world he had once known, was over, and he was left to pick up the pieces. But survival was not an easy thing to grasp when the walls were closing in. His mind raced as he weighed his options. He had long been accustomed to living in a world where trust was a rare commodity and loyalty often a fleeting illusion. He had learned to rely on himself, to keep his plans tight, his allies few, and his movements even fewer. The collapse of the Medellin cartel had not only shattered his empire but had also left him with a fractured network of allies. Most had fled, gone into hiding or worse, betrayed by the very system they had helped create. The sense of camaraderie that once existed within the cartel had vanished, replaced by mistrust and fear. With the death of Pablo Escobar, the cartel had lost its central figure, and without that unifying force, the gangland landscape in Colombia had shifted dramatically. The power vacuum that followed was fierce and unforgiving. Rival cartels, including the Cali cartel, had wasted no time stepping into the void, eager to stake their claim on the lucrative drug trade. The world Cifuentes once ruled was now a battlefield for control, with every faction vying for dominance. But Cifuentes was not a man easily crushed. He had survived through the sheer force of will, through cleverness, and by staying one step ahead of everyone else. Now, as the streets of Medellin became increasingly dangerous, he realized that it was no longer enough to simply survive. He needed to disappear. He needed to vanish into the anonymity of a world that no longer had any place for men like him. The Cali cartel's rise was a reminder of how quickly the tides of power could turn. Where Escobar had ruled through fear and intimidation, the Cali cartel operated with a quieter, more insidious kind of control. It was a power that was rooted in influence, in politics, and in the manipulation of both law enforcement and business leaders. While Escobar had built his empire on violence and terror, the leaders of the Cali cartel had invested heavily in the art of diplomacy, in weaving a complex web of connections that allowed them to operate with greater subtlety. To Cifuentes, the rise of the Cali cartel was both a threat and an opportunity. On the one hand, they were poised to take over the lucrative drug routes that had once belonged to the Medellin cartel. On the other, they were weak in certain areas where Cifuentes knew he could exploit their vulnerabilities. The shifting balance of power made him realize that survival was no longer just about avoiding capture or destruction, it was about navigating the treacherous waters of a new and changing world. But survival in this new world would require more than just cunning. It would require reinvention. Cifuentes knew that the brutal violence of his past, his role as the bombmaker who had sent shockwaves through Colombia's criminal landscape, was now an obstacle. The very skills that had once made him invaluable to the cartel were now liabilities in a world that was shifting away from chaotic violence and toward calculated, corporate-style criminal enterprises. His mind turned to the many men he had known who had fallen by the wayside, those who had been unable or unwilling to adapt to the changing landscape. Some had been killed, their bodies left in the streets as a warning to others. Others had been captured by law enforcement, their lives swallowed up by prison sentences that stretched into eternity. And then there were those who had tried to escape, fleeing to foreign lands, hoping to start over. But even for them, escape was an illusion. No matter how far they ran, their pasts were always there, lingering like a dark cloud, ready to catch up with them. Cifuentes was different, though. He had always been a man who understood the importance of moving in silence, of staying out of the limelight. He had never sought glory or fame. His work had always been about precision, about achieving results without drawing attention. That same skill would serve him now as he began to formulate a plan for his escape. He had learned the hard way that there were no guarantees in the criminal world. One day, you could be on top, and the next, you could be on the run. That was the nature of the game. Cifuentes had played it for years, and he knew the rules. But the stakes were higher now. There were no more allies to rely on, no more powerful figures like Escobar to protect him. There was only Cifuentes, his wits, and the instinct for survival that had kept him alive for so long. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much had changed. The world he had once inhabited was now almost unrecognizable. The brutal wars between cartels, the days of car bombings and shootouts in the streets, were things of the past. The old guard of the Medellin cartel was gone, replaced by new, younger faces who had no memory of the old days. They were ruthless, but they were also calculating, strategic in ways that the previous generation had never been. Cifuentes began to make plans, quietly and methodically. He knew that his best chance for survival lay not in continuing the fight for control of the drug trade, but in leaving it altogether. The world of bombs and violence had already taken everything from him, his loyalty, his comrades, his sense of purpose. It had left him with nothing but a series of broken alliances and shattered memories. But that didn't mean he couldn't find a way to escape. There were always routes out of Colombia, always hidden paths that led to safety. He just needed to find them. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the key to his survival lay not in running from the law, but in running from the ghosts of his past. With that in mind, Cifuentes began to reach out to old contacts, some from the cartel's past, others from the murky world of international crime. He made discreet inquiries, tested the waters, and slowly began to build the network he would need to disappear. The first step was always the hardest. Once you were entrenched in a world like his, there were few people you could trust. But Cifuentes had learned the art of trust the hard way. It was not about loyalty, it was about mutual benefit. If he could convince enough people that helping him escape would serve their own interests, he knew he could make it out alive.